All right, I'm ready.
Just gotta keep going.
I see you again.
Hey, George.
Hey, George.
Hey.
Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to this third session of the fall semester's Education Policy Colloquium, sponsored by the Program on Education Policy and Governance. My name is Jim Pizer. I'm an academic visitor here at Kennedy School. And until last January, I was the Massachusetts Secretary of Education for about 8 years under the Charlie Baker administration. And it's an honor to be part of this program and part of this colloquium series with Paul Peterson and with Marty West. In addition to today's event, we've got 6 more events scheduled coming up over the course of the next couple of months, all here at the Taubman Center and on Thursdays at noon. So hopefully you'll be able to join us for those. There is on the website, there's a schedule of the upcoming sessions. So please check it out and mark your calendars. Our next one is October 12th. That's featuring Joe Olszewski, the former superintendent of schools from Seattle, and Thiru Vignaraja, the former deputy attorney general of Maryland, and the former law clerk to Justice Stephen Breyer. And the title of their session will be Breaking the Promise of Brown, the Seattle Supreme Court Case and its Implications for School Diversity. So I hope you all be able to join us for that session. Today's session is entitled The DC Public Schools Teachers Union Contract, Breaking Ground Through Collective Bargaining. And it features the 2 principals who negotiated that contract back in 2010. Former DCPS Chancellor Michelle Rhee, who's with me just to my right, and former DC Teachers Union President George Parker, who is, hopefully you can see him up there on the Zoom screen. Besides running the DC public schools from 2007 to 2010, Michelle was a TFA teacher in Baltimore, founder of the New Teacher Project, also founder of Students First, and she's now launching another venture called BuildWithin, a software platform that enables work-based learning, in particular around apprenticeships, training, and upskilling. And George is now a senior advisor with the National Alliance for Public Charter Schools, which I'm sure I don't have to tell all of you is a pretty unusual career transition for a teachers union president, and maybe we can even talk about that a little more later. After our conversation, so I'll sort of ask some questions and we'll engage in some sort of moderated dialogue here. But after that, we'll leave plenty of time for questions, answers, and discussion. We'll give priority to folks who are here in the room with us, but we'll also monitor the chat, see if there are any questions online, and we'll try to get those into the conversation as well. This session is being recorded and will be posted on the PEPG website. So in effect, we're all on the record, so keep that in mind. And with that, why don't I start off the discussion by asking you, Michelle, to briefly summarize what the major components were of that 2010 contract, and in particular, what you think had the biggest impact on teacher effectiveness and student achievement.
Sure. So first of all, thank you for being here with us, for inviting me to be here today with you. I would say that first, just to give a little bit of context to this, George and I engaged for a number of years in negotiating this contract. The process was particularly long. We even at one point brought in an outside mediator to help us get to the final product. But we did get here through the collective bargaining process. So that's important to note, that it was not sort of a unilateral decision. This is what we're going to do. We're really at the table for a number of years working really hard on this. The major components of what we negotiated, what's interesting is that people talk a lot about the impact teacher evaluation system, which had plays a role in this whole conversation and what we were able to do. But in DC at the time, the evaluation system itself did not have to be collectively bargained. So we could, as the system management and administrators, determine what the system looked like. What we had to have conversations with George and the union about was the what was going to happen with the information and the data that came from that evaluation process. We entered into this actually on the same page. In our first meeting that George and I ever had, he looked at me and said, I've read about you. I've read the things that you've written. I know the things that you're going to want to negotiate in this contract. And I just want you to know, like, this is not going to be cheap. But he said, you know, teachers in Washington, D.C. right now are the lowest paid teachers in the region. I believe that they have the hardest job of any educators in the region. And so I think they should be the most highly compensated. And I said to him, I agree 100%. So I don't know if he was surprised by that or not when I said it, but we were aligned that we wanted to take DC public school teachers from being the lowest paid in the region to the highest paid. Then what that meant was different. So a few things that I'd say were sort of hallmarks of this contract. First, and probably what most people talk a lot about, is what we call the sort of grand bargain, which was the fact that teachers had the option of choosing either the red path or the green path. On the green path, you could earn up to twice as much money as you did in the old system. You, though, had to sort of agree to certain sort of things as it pertained to seniority, lockstep pay, et cetera. Or you could choose the red path, which meant that you wanted to sort of stick with the old system. So that was sort of one piece to the puzzle. We also, though, and these are things that are talked about less, when we were changing the evaluation system, we put in place a number of things that were codified in the collective bargaining agreement around how the evaluations would take place. So the fact that we would have what were called master educators who would play a key role in the evaluation process. We had heard a lot of feedback from teachers. People who would say, I teach 3-year-old autistic kids. My principal was a high school PE teacher. He knows absolutely nothing about what I'm doing, right? And so we wanted people involved in the evaluation process who were experts in the subject area and grade level that the teachers were being evaluated in. So we had the master educator program. We put in place teacher centers, a really strong focus on professional development. So those are some of the pieces that people talk about less, but were, I think, really key hallmark pieces to why ultimately the agreement was approved overwhelmingly. So at the end of the day, when the vote was had, 80% of the teachers voted for the approval of the contract.
And George, maybe any other additional sort of components of the contract that stand out, but what do you think had the biggest impact on teacher behavior, teacher practice, student outcomes? And to the extent you know, what's sort of both at the time, we talked about the 80% vote initially to approve the contract, but as it got implemented, the extent to which there was continuing teacher support for the key components here, including the evaluation system and the green-red tracks.
And so now, what was your question again there? That was what?
So first of all, just the extent to which you feel that one or more of these were sort of most impactful in terms of improving teacher practice and changing in some ways the culture of the district. And then to the extent that some of those have persisted, if not all of them, what sort of remains, sort of what the teacher attitudes are towards the contract in retrospect or in the present moment.
Okay, let me take the last one first. I think that teachers' attitudes regarding the contract now are very positive. I think that change was difficult to adapt to back in 2010 for sure, but after the system has been in place now for several years, more than 10 years, it has become a part of the normal evaluation process. I think from a union standpoint, some of the most difficult parts for me to overcome in terms of getting my members to to the place where they were ready to accept change. One would be the performance pay piece. Some people call it merit pay. I don't call it merit pay because merit pay had already brought with it a lot of liability. But I think the performance pay piece was a controversial piece. I think another piece that was very unique that I thought had an impact on teachers. First of all, I don't think any of it had an impact as much as the teacher evaluation process, because it brought into place a lot of accountability. I think that probably was one of the most impactful pieces of that had an impact on students. But then those other pieces that I think helped, one was Michelle mentioned, the master educators, which meant you had people who were trained in the area of expertise for each teacher. The math teacher, whether you're a foreign language, English or whatever, you had people who were actually certified in your category and who were master teachers in those fields doing the evaluations, which I thought was good. Also, we had committed to doing an induction program for new teachers, a mentorship induction program, which I think was a great accomplishment. We also had instructional coaches for each school, whose sole job for that instructional coach, who were teachers, but they were outstanding teachers, and their main job was to help those teachers who were struggling. And so I'm talking now about those things that I see in the contract that I thought could impact student achievement right away. I think one of the other pieces was the mutual consent clause, and it was somewhat controversial. I had to really do some discussion with a lot of folks to get them to understand the mutual consent piece, because prior to that, if teachers had to be cut, either due to budget or reduction in the number of students and et cetera, pretty much it was a seniority-driven piece. If a teacher had to be transferred from one school to the other, how proficient and how good the teacher was at teaching didn't matter. If I had been at a school for 7 years and another teacher had been at a school for 9 years, then automatically, if a teacher had to be transferred due to budget cuts, the teacher who was there for 7 years would have to go because I'd been there 9. Had no consideration to who was the teacher who was getting better results. Mutual consent could change the whole process to the point that your performance counted more than how long you've been teaching. That was a big adjustment for teachers. Another piece that I thought was very positive and effective was professional development. We added a lot of professional development and committed to add 3 teacher centers that would be focused on professional development. And one of the big pieces was salaries. I mean, DC teachers were number 6 in the market, which was last in terms of when we began this contract. And when we completed this contract, DC teachers were number 1, which means that all of a sudden we had teachers wanting to come to DC. Money did play a part. I know teachers who are outstanding in the DMV, that's the District, Maryland and Virginia, who left Maryland and Virginia to come to DC because of that salary structure. So those are some of the key components.
And there are 2 other parts just of the pay scale, which maybe you can comment on as well. So part of it was performance-based, but there was also that you were teaching in a high need or high poverty school, and also that you were in a field that was, in shortage or that was a high priority. Any sense for sort of whether all 3 of those are kind of equally relevant and important in terms of affecting teacher, not only teacher practice and teacher performance, but also kind of where teachers want to teach within the district, or whether, one or more of them seem to carry more weight?
I mean, we struggled with the same challenges that most school districts do, right? Which is that some schools were seen as, oh, these are the sort of most desirable schools because they were in the parts of town where parents would, do an auction every year and get a whole lot more resources into the school. And so you always knew that you were going to have your prep periods because there was an art, music, and PE teacher there, as opposed to schools on the other side of town who did not have that kind of resourcing. And then you're literally teaching, all day, every day, because we don't have a music teacher, et cetera. And so we wanted to structure the system in a way where, to your point, Jim, the effectiveness of the teacher was of sort of preeminent importance, but in order to sort of get the maximum amount of performance pay, it was based on your effectiveness teaching in a high need school and in a high need subject area. And we really do believe that, did believe at the time, and I think this sort of data bears this out, that it did encourage more people from the subject areas that we were most in need of. It attracted more of those folks from school districts around the region.
I probably should have said at the outset, if you look at NAEP's scores, and there are other indicators as well, that the district's performance was on an upward trajectory before 2010, but has persisted and accelerated its improvement in a way that is very unusual among urban districts and relative to the national average, because really the national average since 2010 has been pretty much flat, and not counting the sort of recent COVID decline. But DC public schools have been growing apace. And again, it's very much an outlier, and whether it's causation or correlation, I'm not sure it really matters, but the results have been pretty impressive. About 85% of the teachers, based on the most recent data that I've seen anyway, in DC are rated effective or highly effective, and something like 95% of those teachers are retained, meaning they're still employed in the following year. And about 1% are rated ineffective, and about 95% of them are not teaching in the following year. Are those numbers sort of what you would have expected when you negotiated this agreement back in 2010? Are they sort of higher, lower? And in terms of the sort of retention numbers, are they also similar to what you would expected, or is there room for improvement there?
I'm sure George has a lot to say on this one. Well, the numbers now are different from what the numbers look like right after we implemented, and that's to be expected, right? Because the teacher evaluation system that was in place for decades before this was implemented, I mean, there really was no accountability. And so in those first couple of years, you probably saw much more significant numbers of people moving out, being identified and moving out. But then over time, because we're talking now, 13 years later, that's sort of, those numbers have stabilized. So are they about where I would anticipate for having been implemented this long? Probably.
George, what do you think about that?
Actually, I think when the contract was implemented, I had no vision of what percent of teachers we were shooting for. I think that it was more about making sure that there was an accountability system in place, and there was a support system in place that could help teachers achieve good results from students. I think the 85% is a good number, and I really think the 95% is an excellent number, especially in terms of teacher retention, given the teacher shortage at this time. I think that the supports that were put in place help teachers to achieve a greater level of performance. But I like the numbers, and I think they're good numbers. I hope that DC can maintain and keep those numbers going. But I also think the salary had a lot to do with it, because I found before I left that the district was beginning to really attract some high-level teachers because of the pay and because of the other structures that were put into place.
And they are numbers that are quite starkly different from what you see in other large urban school districts. This data might be a little old, but remember a few years ago, someone shared with me some data that showed of the highest performing teachers in other urban school districts, like a lot of those people were churning out, and that DC was an outlier in being able to retain the majority, the vast majority of their most highly effective teachers.
There tends to be in systems like this, or performance evaluation systems, a little bit of grade inflation over time. Any sense, and George, you may be aware of this more than Michelle at this point, but any sense for whether the kind of standards for evaluation have been maintained over the course of time?
Pretty much it has been maintained. There was a few changes, I think, that under Kaya, that was Michelle's, Kaya was chancellor following Michelle. They took the percentage down, which I thought was a good move. And as data came in from 50% of the teachers' evaluation being based on student test scores to 35%. I think the incentive program, and it was a very, very I think strong incentive program. Teachers could earn up to $20,000 extra as a bonus. That's a lot of money for you to pick up in addition as a teacher for your performance. So I think all of those things have helped to maintain the level of interest and the level of retention in DC public schools. One of the things that I am a little disappointed with that has not been followed through on, and I get it, that what's in writing doesn't matter as much as the commitment of those who have responsibility to implement it. One of the things I was disappointed in, and it was not the district's fault, but the union leader who became president following me, we had a clause in the contract that provided for what we called non-traditional scheduling, which would allow the staff at a given school with 66 2/3% of the vote to decide they wanted to have a different school day and even a different school year. It was controversial, but I thought it actually empowered the local school to decide, what do we need to make our school successful? Do we need Saturday school? Do we need a longer school day, and et cetera? I was disappointed that after I left, the union did not follow up with that, and that pretty much has not been implemented. The union started to encourage teachers not to vote in favor of changing those traditional scheduled schools. But overall, I think that the contract, I talked with the attorney just the other day just to see how much of the contract has been maintained, and it's well over 90%.
So are there parts of the contract that if you had to do it over again, you would do differently, or that you would add or subtract from the agreement, or do you stand by your work as being pretty solid and stands up the sort of test of time?
I mean, look, when we were moving from an evaluation system, which literally was just like a perfunctory walk into the classroom, check a few boxes, and roll out 10 minutes later system, to something that was much more comprehensive. It was the first time that student achievement growth was being measured and was factored into the teacher's evaluation. And we didn't know. I mean, we knew generally that the notion was right, but 50%, 30%, we didn't know that 50% was absolutely right. But we had to put a stake in the ground somewhere. And that's where we decided. I think that anytime you are engaging in a process like this, you want to sort of have some foundational convictions, but then also be open to, like, let's see how this goes. I remember when we were in the midst of negotiating this, I was talking to we were involved in like union discussions where people kind of were sort of saying from other unions, well, we would be okay with this percentage or that percentage. And I was like, look, nobody knows, right? So let's do something, or maybe we can, be engaged in something where we find 30 school districts around the country who are wanting to take something like this on, and we put 10 of them at 50% and 10 of them at 35%, and the other 10 at, 42.5, right? Because we can all agree that the current system was not working. Teachers didn't like it, administrators liked it, nobody liked it. We're moving into new territory. There's no roadmap for this, but let's commit to trying something, measuring how effective or not it is, and then sort of, making modifications from there. And I think that is, what Kai and her team were very much focused on, is like, was 50% right? Why not? They did end up lowering it a bit. And the other thing that they did based on teacher impact was they broadened the tools that were used to measure what that progress was. And so I think, as long as that openness to modifications and changes exist, then I think it's like less important what you start with, and more like, being able to be responsive.
Yep. And maybe George, you can comment on that question as well, but also, given the apparent support for the contract among the teachers themselves, given the success the district has experienced over the last, 15 years or so, why aren't we seeing more union leadership like yours, George, and more districts that are adopting similar kinds of provisions? Now, some of it may be happening, but for example, the amount of compensation or bonus that is capable of being earned tends to be, to the extent those provisions are in contracts, tends to be fairly small, maybe not large enough to change behavior or to improve outcomes. But George, any sense for kind of why this hasn't taken the country by storm, and people are saying, well, look what's happened in DC, we need to do the same thing?
I think it was a lot of change very quickly, which meant, I think one of the challenges that we had, and one of the changes that I had as a union president, was to get members acclimated to thinking differently about change, because change, it encounters resistance. We had to do a great job of being transparent with teachers, but to inform teachers about the need for certain things. And we got pushback. There was pushback. There's no question. But I think it was to create a culture where teachers were moving from what currently was to this new piece that presented more accountability, but at the same time presented more support and more rewards as a teacher, especially on the financial level. It empowered teachers. But I think one of the key advantages was mayoral control, because to put those kind of changes in place, you can't get caught up into the politics. And I remember saying to Michelle that mayoral control eliminated a lot of the fight that I had, because when we had a board of education, all I had to do was make sure that I contributed financially to the majority of the board members. And when there come that I didn't like, all I'd have to do is call on the board members that we supported and say, look, we need you, we supported you financially, we need you to stop this. And 90% of the time I could get it stopped.
Don't give away any trade secrets here, George.
Well, I'm just saying, that's the bottom line. All right. And that's how most school districts operate. I mean, look, Board of Education positions for the most part are elected positions. And so when you run, you need campaign contributions, and unions take advantage of that. But I think to put these kind of changes in, the more you could eliminate the political part of it, then it was needed. That, I think that's one of the reasons why you don't see it, is that because of the bureaucracy that's engaged or that's involved in creating this level of change so quickly that it's very difficult to do it when you have to go through 9 to 13 members of the board and they're hearing things from everybody. We don't like this, we do like that. You got everybody cooking the cake. And when you have mayoral control, it was just, we had one mayor who was committed to change. We had the chancellor committed to change, and this crazy union guy that was committed to change. And
But is that like the perfect storm? I mean, I don't know how often Adrian Fenty's come along,
They know.
let alone Michelle Rhee's or George Parker's, but having the three of them together in the same place in the same time.
Yeah. I
seems
mean,
hard to
I'll
replicate.
put this more plainly than George, because that was the politically correct version. The reason why this has not been adopted more broadly is because Adrian lost his election doing this, and George lost his election doing this. And I had the easiest job of the three of us, to be frank. I was the person who got to implement the things that I thought were good and right for kids. George, meanwhile, is, having to wrangle through all of his executive board and membership, et cetera. And Adrian had, his, but at the end of the day, even with the results, it required these two gentlemen who were elected to their posts taking an incredibly courageous stand, being willing to withstand a tremendous amount of backlash, pressure, et cetera. And at the end of the day, they lost their reelection bids. And so most people who are in politically elected positions always think to themselves, well, the world is going to be better off if I stay in office, right? And they want to be reelected. And so this, I think, to some people was like a very cautionary tale, like, don't take on education reform, don't be too aggressive, or else you will, suffer the same fate as Adrian and George did.
So where does that leave us? I mean, there were certainly, after Adrian Fenty's term, there were some other mayors who, stepped up and took control or sought control of their districts, urban districts in particular. It seems to have gone a little bit out of favor, and even in places where it's happened, contracts like this don't seem to necessarily have emerged. Is there a way to sort of recreate the environment of the sort of early 2000s, or have we moved past that and somehow have to find another way to get where you ended up getting when you were in the position?
So I will fully admit the fact that we had sort of the perfect storm of circumstance come together, because it wasn't just mayoral control with a mayor who was like single-mindedly focused on this, and a union leader who was willing to sort of break the mold and think differently. But we were in a city state. And so the mayor is essentially also the governor, right? So we had certain state level policies, like you don't have to negotiate the evaluation tool, right? We had a charter system that when I got there, about a third of the kids were in the charter system, that was putting tremendous pressure on the system to change. Had that not been in place, it would have been much more difficult to make the case. We had philanthropic support, right, coming to the table, which was very unusual. I was telling Paul, we were in a city that was attractive. Like, young people were reading about what we were doing and were like, I want to move to DC and be a part of this. If we were doing this in Pocatello, Idaho, I don't know, right? So there were so many incredibly unique factors where all of the stars were aligned that allowed us to do this. And people often ask me, well, if you could do one of those things, what would it be, and whatever. And my answer to that is always like, there is no silver bullet to this. There was no one factor that led to the success. It was, instead of 100% solution, it was probably 52% solutions.
So yeah, George, go on.
I think that one unexpected occurrence has maybe opened the doorway for pressure for change. And that is, I think one of the things that came out of the pandemic, I think, is that parents experienced right at firsthand the inability of a lot of school districts to educate their children, or they learned how it was happening. They got some real live hand, on hand experience in terms of the virtual education and et cetera. I think that a lot of parents who did not pay attention to their children's education prior to the pandemic are beginning to pay more attention to their education. I'm hoping that that parental involvement will lead to more pressure on school boards and superintendents and on the unions to do something that is really going to affect positive change and outcomes for their children. So hopefully that door is opening again, where parents are going to demand educational quality for their children by experiencing what they experienced during the pandemic. I think parents really for the first time experienced firsthand how broken our public educational system is.
So I certainly hope that you're right about that. I'm not sure I see, unfortunately, a lot of evidence that that's the direction of engagement at this point. I mean, there's a lot of, so obviously at school board meetings around the country, there's a lot of parent involvement, but I'm not sure it's on these subjects and focusing.
Yeah, I
on
agree.
Solutions. But Michelle, you mentioned the charter school sector, and George, you were talking about external parent pressure, if you will. So DC is somewhat unique in terms of the size of its charter sector. You said it was about a third when you were there. It's probably about half now. The interesting thing is that the performance of both the charter sector and the district have sort of moved up in tandem with one another. So it's not as if the charter sector has been, wildly outpacing the district. In some ways, the district may be outpacing the charter sector, but on some measures. But they've both been moving up together, which is sort of the win-win that everyone would have hoped for. Again, we don't see that being embraced in too many other places around the country. But at the time, how important was the charter sector as a sort of competitive, if you will, factor to getting this agreement done at the time?
Yeah, I think it was a huge part of it. And I came in, I still am a school choice advocate. I never think that any parent should be in a position where they do not have choice as to where their kids attend school. I use that very much to my advantage when dealing with George, because I was a school choice advocate. I didn't see like, oh, if charters grow, then that's a loss for the district. That's just wasn't my mentality. And so I remember one particular conversation, George, I don't know if you'll remember this or not, but we were focused on kind of trying to figure out a turnaround strategy for a particular school. And the leadership there and some of the teachers were interested in moving towards a different model. And I was trying to get George on board with it. And I said to him, hey, you got two choices. We can do this within the system and you guys can come to the table and allow for this innovation to happen. Or like, I can turn it over, the building over to a charter school management organization, right? And he was like, all right, we'll play ball, right? I would not have been able to do that were it not for the pressures of the charter school system. So for that reason, I think that competition in charter schools can be helpful. That said, I would also say that I have learned a tremendous amount in the process, because the whole notion around charter schools to begin with was a notion of accountability, right? Let's charter these schools. Let's have the charter sort of lay out what the expectations are for what the school will be able to accomplish. If the school is not able to accomplish that, then you don't renew the charter, et cetera, which I think was a good and healthy sort of dynamic. What I didn't realize fully at the time when I was running the system was that that not all sort of charter advocates were, they would sort of say like, yes, competition is a good thing. And for a while, like when I took over the system, the charter the charter schools were far outpacing the district in terms of enrollment and performance, et cetera. And when that was happening, the charter folks who liked me because I was very pro-choice, were like, see, Michelle, competition is a good thing, right? What was interesting was that after we put the paper performance system in place, I got calls from folks in the charter industry who were like, wait, Michelle, this is causing us a problem because now we have our top performing teachers who are saying that they want to move to DCPS. We need to think about a consolidated salary schedule. And I said, hold on. When you had the competitive advantage and the competition was a good thing, but now that we've put something in place, now you don't want any competition with the salaries, no. you can't have it both ways, right? But it was fascinating to me how that shifted. And I would say that it was probably in the long term better for the charter system as well, for them to have a higher performing school district where it wasn't just a given that if you were unhappy at DCPS, then you'd move over to the charter schools, that we had more and more traditional schools that were performing better and, there was a real choice to be had. I think has pushed the charter sector to become better as well.
So George, you're now part of the charter sector.
Yeah.
What's your sort of perspective on that dynamic both then and now?
Well, I can tell you then, I remember having a meeting with my board. It was probably one of the most heated meetings I had with the board, where I was indicating that a lot of the changes that we needed in the contract was because charters was really out competing us in terms of student performance, and that unless we were able to improve the traditional public schools, that we were going to continue to lose more and more teachers. And the bottom line for a union is that, and especially in DC and in most urban districts, is that whenever you have, the more charters you have, you're beginning to lose teachers, because as those students go to charter schools, the charter schools are employing your teachers, and you need fewer teachers in your traditional public schools. So that results in fewer teachers paying union dues. So that cuts down on the amount of incomes that unions have to work with in order to promote their political agenda. We had this big argument about that because there were members of my board who felt that charters would just disappear. And I'm like, no, they are not. These parents are voting with their feet. Most charters had waiting lists. And so it was clearly a motivation for me to try to create change, because charters were outperforming the district. And I said, we need change in what we're doing. That's one of the reasons why I was disappointed in the non-traditional schedule that the union after I left did not support that, because I feel that schools need to have more individualized autonomy, which charters had, to say, let the teachers and the parents and those at that school decide, here's what we need. How do we cover the learning loss? Well, at this particular school, you may have to have a longer school day. And at other schools, you may not need to have a longer school day. But charters were definitely one of my incentives to try to create change in our contract that would allow more flexibility for schools to really meet the needs of their students.
And did charters, Michelle, sort of picking up what you were saying, did charters actually respond so that their labor management relations and compensation packages start to mirror the district, or are they still kind of, in a very different place?
I think some of them did, some of them did not. But, I think those that knew that in DCPS, the compensation, it was compensation system number one, but also a lot of the professional development pieces that we put in place. It used to be back in the day that the charters were really the only game in town. If you cared about good professional development, et cetera, you had to go to a charter. I think once we put those things in place and DCPS was competitive on not just salaries, but also the supports. It made people sit up and take notice. And I will say that had none of the charters, if all the charters had decided, you know what, we're just going to stick with our schedules of a salary, et cetera, I think the sort of differential would have been even larger in favor of the traditional public schools.
One of the things that we did at the Alliance, and this is recently with the Harris poll, where they polled both traditional public school teachers and charter teachers, and the results showed that charter teachers were actually happier at their schools and felt better supported. This was a poll that was taken this year than traditional public school teachers. So I think that the competition that charter schools are presenting is going to be there. Parents are more and more favorable toward charter schools. And I think it all has to do with the individual ability for charter schools to make quick decisions and more autonomy. But the teachers at charters, even when they were making less money, seem to have been more satisfied with their school leadership and their school performance.
So let's sort of transition here and open up to some questions and answers from the floor. Paul, let me turn to you first. Any sort of comments, reflections, or questions you might have?
Well, I'm going to change the subject a little bit here by asking both of you to comment on something that I've been involved in the last a week or so. All these new emerging alternative approaches to education. There's a homeschooling movement has expanded, and we now have these micro schools and alternative schools and learning online and so forth. And Michelle, you are heading up a new emerging school model. I mean, you've left the established system. You're now at BuildWithin, which, as I understand it, is an organization that's taking kids who've dropped out of high school maybe, or are not ready to go to community college, and you're saying we're going to provide an educational experience. Can you tell us a little bit about this model and whether you think this is the model of the future? And you're working with the labor unions now on this instead of fighting labor unions. You're now you're in their pocket, so to speak. So, and I'd like to get your comment on this too, George. So could you talk about that? Quite a change. Yeah.
So my company BuildWithin is a software company, and we have a platform that makes it easier for employers to start and manage apprenticeship programs. So it's outside of sort of the traditional K to 16 education space, but it's, there's some connections. And essentially, we have a problem with this country in that you have 11 million jobs that go unfilled every year because employers are saying they can't find the skilled talent that they need. Yet at the same time, we have about 9 million and underemployed people, many of whom would love to move into those empty jobs, but don't feel like they have the access, the resources, or the knowledge to do so. So how are you going to bridge that gap? Well, when most of those job seekers are looking at those open positions, they think to themselves, I could never do that job. I don't know anything about it. I don't have the proper education. So they think I would have to go back and get a 4-year degree or a 2-year master's, or at the very least a 6-month boot camp. But the reality is that most job seekers cannot afford to have a gap in income, number one, much less to be paying something out of pocket during that time. So the apprenticeship model, we believe, is one that just makes absolute sense, because in apprenticeships, someone has a full-time job with benefits from day one, but the expectation is that they are learning on the job. So they can learn a new career, industry, trade. For the most part in this country, apprenticeships have been really focused on trades and construction. And our company BuildWithin believes that the model can be utilized much more broadly across industries and sectors. And I was telling Paul that the fascinating thing for me has been that, like, when I was in education, reform was so polarizing, so divisive, right? Everybody has a super strong opinion. In apprenticeships, everybody loves apprenticeships. It's fascinating. Republicans, Democrats, unions, corporations, like everyone loves the apprenticeship model. So my question when I got into this was, well, if a model has such broad-based support, then why does it have such low adoption rates, right? And it is because it is actually very difficult to start an apprenticeship program, put one in place, lots of buy-in that you need to get at different levels. And so that's what we're really focused on right now. But one of the fascinating things, and apprenticeships can be utilized sort of across the board. So we have mid-career folks, we have seniors who retired and want to come back into the workforce, people who were out of the workforce, either because they were incarcerated or, child rearing, who want to come back in. But one segment in particular that a lot of jurisdictions have a focus on is out of school youth. So 18 to 24-year-olds. And I was talking about the fact that, like, for this group of young people, as an example, they're digital natives. They know how to, like, work it for likes on social media. They're very adept at that. So the idea that they could take those transferable skills and be able to move into a social media coordinator or digital marketing position with a company, it's not a huge leap, right? They need some level of training on how do you take it from, like, doing this on your personal level to doing it for a corporation? What does that look like? What are some of the kind of structures around that? But I think what it is doing is it's giving young people an opportunity to see themselves in, for example, a tech job that they used to think was completely out of reach for them. We're saying, actually, you have a lot of skills that could be super helpful in this job. Here are some additional ones that you need to learn, but being able to do that in the context of being in that position, having sort of mentorship, having very clear content that they're learning, we think is a model for the future. Absolutely.
George, you have a comment.
Yeah, I fully support alternative models to education. I commend Michelle for doing this. I do not believe that the traditional school model that we have in this country meets the needs of all students. It's impossible. And I think that we have to have alternative school models. My granddaughter is in an online schooling program now, and I'm very satisfied with it. I think that students learn differently. And I think that we have to have alternative educational models if we expect to really educate all children. I support charter schools. I support traditional public schools. I support online schools. The barometer for me is the quality of that school. That's the bottom line. Does it work? Does it work, and is it educating children? And I think it is more about the future is adapting education to the child rather than adapting the child to education. And that's what goes on in traditional schools pretty much. The child comes in and you have to adapt to that particular style of education and that culture, rather than we adapting the education to the student. And I think that what Michelle is doing and online schooling and et cetera, you can adapt the education to the child. Children learn differently. And so I'm in favor of it. But the key barometer for me is that it has to be quality.
Other questions from anyone in the room? Antonio?
We talked a lot about how assessments have been a useful tool, both back in the day for you guys, both for teachers and for students. But here in Massachusetts, we're starting to think that maybe we don't need some of the assessments that we've been using to sort of push our schools forward in a positive way. It was very important for you guys to have these assessments. Now we have all of these new types of learning. How do we incorporate the assessments that we have, and is there value in it for these new school models?
I think that a lot of the pushback to assessments and testing, you could understand it, because one of the things that happened was like an overemphasis, right? Teaching to the test. And, you'd have these stories both from parents and kids and teachers of like, well, after the test is over, then, don't have to worry about anything. And I think that was unfortunate, right? And in some ways, that's why you could sort of see, like, because that didn't make any sense to people. We're not educating the kids. They're not going to school every day so that they can do well on the test. The test should have been a tool through which we, like a means to an end, not the end in itself. And so I think that it's important to measure, right? You have to have some measurement. You have to have a way of determining, like, is a kid, gaining the skills that they need to be successful. One of the things that I was involved in for a period was a parent sort of advocacy group in Charleston, South Carolina. And in that program, one of the first things that they did was they shared with parents all of the test data from the schools that their kids were attending. And it was an incredibly emotional session, because a lot of the parents were like, only 9% of the kids at my kid's school are on grade level in math. Like, and they literally started crying, like, why hasn't anybody told us this before? This is crazy. I don't want them, like, they have a 90% chance of, failure. So there is an importance to being able to measure where kids are, taking that information and sort of furthering what we're doing. But we have to use the tools have to be utilized in the right way. You have to be open to kind of modifying tools when they're not working, and you have to be open to modifying approaches when they're creating the wrong culture and dynamics.
Other questions? Yes.
Thank you so much for coming to speak with us. I'm also a former teacher, so I was really excited to hear your talk. So teachers nowadays, obviously with the COVID-19 pandemic, curriculum level changes. I'm thinking of things happening in Florida, school shootings, they're facing a lot of different challenges. But there's also, as we've touched on, some really exciting new opportunities when it comes to technology and helping students learn more. So one thing, George and Michelle, that you both touched on a lot was motivation. So what's motivating these teachers? How do you tap into both intrinsic and extrinsic motivation? And my question is for all three of you, what kinds of support do you think that compared to 2010 that teachers really need now that you can kind of harness and turn into positive motivation? I imagine for many teachers, their intrinsic motivation might have shifted a little bit, especially over the past 2 years. So kind of open-ended, what do you think that teachers need now in terms of support that might be different than in the past?
So interestingly enough, my daughter is a teacher right now. She's in her second year of teaching. After, as a young person, she told me, like, I will never do what you did. That's terrible. Now teaching. And one of the things that she said to me the other day is, she's like, it is so, she spends a lot of her time planning, as most great teachers do. She's like, it is ridiculous to me that in this day and age, there is no central repository that teachers can go to be able to access and catalog great lessons. She's like, there's some things where you can like sell your lesson plans. She's like, but this should be like, how do we not have this in this day and age? And I said to her, I was like, that can't be right. She's like, I'm telling you, this is right. So it's fascinating to me that with all of the technology that we have, all of the sort of constant communication that people have with people who are literally across the globe, that we cannot, or someone hasn't figured out a way yet to do this. I think those are the kinds of things that teachers are looking for. Is everyone who goes into teaching knows, I would say it's like literally the hardest job that there is, and so little appreciation. George was talking about sort of the dynamics of the pandemic. I also think that one of the positive things that came from the pandemic, what parents saw, like, this is not easy, this is hard, when they were like in front of their kids, like trying to get their kids to pay attention. I think that there was some level of appreciation for like what teachers have to do every day. And trying to find those ways and resources that can take the parts of teachers' jobs that are super time consuming and quite frankly, like unnecessary to have to do for every individual teacher, I'd have to do over and over and over again. And for us to focus resources on that seems obvious.
George, you want to chime in on?
No, I was thinking about a conversation I had recently, maybe with some teachers, and it was about preparing younger teachers for the culture of the students they're teaching. You know, today, the majority of our students in traditional public school systems are kids of color. I think that a lot of teachers come into the profession today without having had any training or exposure to how to meet the cultural needs of those students or understand the cultural needs of those students. I think that giving teachers support, first of all, in educational institutions that are training teachers need to expand their programs to understand that there are cultural differences in students in terms of coming from poverty areas or students of color, and prepare those teachers for that. But where education institutions do not do it, I think the school districts, and whether it's a brick and mortar building or whether we'll talk about online education, that there has to be a realization that the students come from different backgrounds, and that as a teacher, for you to be a successful, that you need to know how to relate to those cultural pieces. I found that as an issue in many schools, and even in charter schools that I look at today, is that you have to prepare teachers not just for their academic information, but also to understand how to relate to students based on their culture, and giving support to teachers in that area.
Jim, if I can just add, at our conference that we just had, John Bailey, who's an expert in artificial intelligence, had an idea which adds to what Michelle was saying. And that is that any teacher can now say, okay, I want a lesson plan to cover this topic that will focus with examples from sports or whatever is the topic that is going to appeal to the students in that particular classroom. And you can actually ask, if you get one of the advanced versions, you can get artificial intelligence to prepare that lesson for you. Now, I don't know if he's right or wrong, but I do sort of feel like this is a potential tool that teachers might be able to exploit in the future.
I mean, even beyond that, the ability, people have been talking about differentiated instruction for forever, and I'm not sure much of it happens. But being able to differentiate a lesson for the, different kinds of students you might have in a classroom, which is very difficult to do, let alone time consuming. Presumably there's some AI applications for that as well.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Other questions? Michael, have anybody online? Yes.
Hi, I just want to thank both of you for coming. I went to the DC Public Schools for 7 years, and reading about the changes that you put in place starting in the 2000s encouraged me to go into education policy. So just want to thank you for coming. We talked a lot in some class about like how we talked about a lot of standards-based education. Now we went into accountability and school choice. What kind of changes are we going to see going forward in the education policy movement?
I'm sort of more on the workforce side now than I am in the education side. So I'm not in it every day, but I from my friends and former colleagues, I have heard a lot, Paul, around what you were talking about, sort of like the idea of like the micro school, I think is very interesting to a lot of families coming out of the pandemic. I think, somebody, I was at a conference the other day and somebody said to me, you used to be one of those people who was like focused on like college at all costs. And I was like, actually, I've never been one of those people. My thing when I was in education was I want kids to have options. They graduate from high school, they have the option to go to college if they so choose and they are prepared to do that. Or if they want to go straight into a career, they also have the skills and competence to be able to do that. And the reality is, like, we're living in such a wildly different world now. My husband and I live in this apartment building, and when we moved in, we realized like we are the oldest people in this apartment building, like times two. We're in our 50s, and they're all like 20 somethings. And we're trying to figure out like, how do these young folks, like, what are they doing that they can afford to live in this, fancy apartment building? So my husband's like, I'm going to find out. So every time he got on the elevator, he'd ask everybody, what do you do? What do you do? What do you do? He comes back to me a few weeks later and he's like, okay, they're content creators, they're gamers, they're in crypto, they're cannabis. These are all things that 5 years ago, nobody thought would be a real job or that you could make money from. They did not go to school for 16 years to learn how to do this, right? And so the world is just changing so rapidly. So the idea that you're going to go to school for 16 years and learn, and then you're going to choose a profession and do is just like antiquated and outdated. And I think young people are now looking at all the options and saying, well, should I take on debt to go to a 4-year college, right? So I think that there's a forcing mechanism here. And so many new opportunities are going to not just be available to people who haven't, gotten a 4-year degree, but there is no 4-year degree that you can get that's going to teach you how to, be effective in those jobs. And so I think that's going to be really interesting to see how that impacts the education system.
And George, what's your response to that? Including
I agree
charter
100%.
sector?
I think educational options are going to be the wave of the future. It goes back to what I said earlier, that education being adapted to the needs of the student versus the student adapting to the education that is being provided. I think that online education, apprenticeships, all of these things that are different and new, that is the way of the future, because it's going to be demanded by students. And because I agree with you, Michelle, I used to be one of those people who it's like, okay, everybody's going to college. And it's like, no, you don't have to go to college always. You can start things new. So I love the apprenticeship piece, but also think that educational options, that if you want online schooling, if that works for you, fine, you do it.
And George, quickly, just on the charter side of this, in some places, based on either the laws or the authorizer, sometimes the charters are actually more constrained than district schools or non-charter schools in terms of their ability to be, sort of truly out of the box, like a micro school or something like that. Any thoughts on how the sort of policy discussions in the charter sector might be engaging with this topic about creating more and more diverse options?
I think that's an ongoing discussion. I think one of the limits that I put on charter schools is the opposition to charter schools. And so charter schools in a lot of situations are constrained. I agree with you, and it's more political than it is educationally. But then there are some charter schools that have the freedom to really reach out there and do things. One of the things that I've been talking about is with charters, we have to make sure, though, that there's a strong system of accountability from the charter movement, not just by individual state laws, because they will close a charter. But I think that the charter movement itself has to get engaged to the point of being able to provide assistance to schools that are struggling, for principals or school leaders who are not necessarily good leaders. But I hear you, and I think you're so right in terms of some charters are being, in some states, they're so restricted in terms of what they could do And I think that's a matter of just loosening up and inviting different educational options, whether the charters or whatever type of schools they are. But I agree with you that there are some constraints. Now, the one thing I do like about charters that doesn't occur in traditional public schools, most laws are set so they will close a bad performing charter school. We don't do it for a public school, a traditional public school. But I think for any of it, that all of it should be about the rubric for me is it successful? Does it work? More than I'm concerned about what kind of school it is.
Paul?
Should wrap.
Oh, we're wrapping up. Oh, yes. Thank you.
Oh, wow.
14, we've got 1 minute
moves
left, maybe
fast.
less. So maybe if both of you have any sort of closing thoughts or hopeful ideas, maybe, so we end on a positive note. Love to hear from you now. George, why don't we start with you?
I have a very simple phrase that the future is changing in education. Embrace it and be a part of the change.
All right, Michelle.
I'd say that, right now not just in sort of education circles, but like across the country, there's such like polarization that's going on, and the debates tend to happen, or the, narratives are created on these incredibly like polarized extremes where very few people actually are at those extremes. The vast majority of people are in the middle and want to have like reasonable discussions and come to like reasonable solutions. And for whatever reason, I'd say my generation of leaders has not been able to figure out like how do you have those discussions in the middle. And so that would be my thing to like the next generation of leaders, like how are you going to create spaces and places where the 80% of people who are in the middle who are like, yeah, we need to change, and maybe we need to give a little on that, and we'll try this. How can that happen over the next few years? Because I think as long as we remain in these polarized places where the extremists can have so much impact on what's going on in the country, I think we're not going to make the progress that we need.
So on that note, thank you all for being here today. Thank you, Michelle. Thank you, George.
Thank you, everybody.
And join us next Thursday at noon. See you then.